would like to introduce Mr. Thomas Fureder, Managing Director of Barclays Investment Bank. Ms. Federica Gallina, Partner and Head of Investments Europe Sustainable Infrastructure and Partners. And Mr. Ulrich, Laumanns, Project Manager of Deutsche Gesellschaft für Internationale, Zusammenarbeit. So, we have talked a lot about energy transition and all this kind of stuff. Decarbonization of the global economy is one of the most essential targets and challenges of the 21st century. The reduction of GHG emissions is the key to mitigate global warming and its effects on human societies and ecosystems. Towards this direction, Europe has adopted in June 2023 two delegated acts on hydrogen, especially on green hydrogen. So hydrogen will contribute to the effort of decarbonization, and in order to obtain the goals set for 2050, which is a quite ambitious goal, to be climate neutral in 2050. So, in the light of the above, as far as I know, some measures have been adopted. For example, Germany will have to date already established more than 100 hydrogen stations. In Greece, this is not the case due to the fact that the regulatory framework is quite at an embryonic stage. So, Mr. Fureder, let's start with you. What do you think on this? Do you think that use cases which currently seem to work could be further developed in Europe in general?
Thank you for the question. I think prior to really going into specific use cases, I would just like to make 2 or 3 comments on my overall view on how we see the hydrogen economy developing, and maybe just two words on myself. I'm Thomas Fureder. I'm in Barclays Investment Banking on the power utilities group, so we cover all the big utilities in Europe, and we're working with them on all types of strategic discussions, financing, equity raises, and as part of that, we also started developing our expertise in the hydrogen sphere. So I'm covering the hydrogen topics more from a project point of view. We also have colleagues that are looking at the hydrogen economy more from the equipment supplier point of view and the OEM side of view. During my years at Barclays for the last 3-4 years, I started looking into the hydrogen economy back when COVID was just hitting, and the EU came out with its first strategy how to really revitalize the economy after the COVID shock, and started working on some hydrogen modeling with consultants for Europe. And it was very clear back then that there's a big opportunity, and I see the biggest opportunity of hydrogen or of molecules in the broader sense in really managing the big issue we have once gas is out of the system, how to accommodate the seasonality question. And therefore I see a long-term future of hydrogen and a long-term use case for hydrogen. The problem is just as long as there's gas in the system, this seasonality is not really paid for. So nobody will pay 3, 4, 5 times for a service that can be easily done by gas currently. And therefore, during the last 2-3 years, we thought about what are really the use cases that would make sense, and I would characterize them into 4 categories. The first one is really the infrastructure build-out, and the infrastructure build-out is a chicken and egg thing. Nobody will start building large pipelines, large storage facilities without really having the counterparty booking those volumes. Those volumes won't be booked if there's no infrastructure there, so who is really making the first step there? There's some movement now also with lots of the IPSA projects that were just being announced this week. We see a substantial part of those IPSA projects are in the infrastructure deployment phase, helping to build a grid and a storage infrastructure in the first place. There's also an ongoing debate in various membership countries. I know more specifically for Germany, for example, where there is a framework being developed so that you avoid charging the initial customers really exorbitant high prices for using the infrastructure, and the later customers are then benefiting from it with some sort of model that basically allows you to accumulate a deficit in the first half of the asset life that is then charged to the customer in the second asset life. So first one is infrastructure projects. I think there is development happening now, but it's heavily dependent on really a regulatory framework that ultimately needs to be underwritten by the EU or by state membership countries. But there's development there, so also investment opportunities. The second pillar is the pillar that is relying not really on subsidies, but on regulation. And a good example in that category, in my view, is the RED II directive on the refining side. So you see a lot of current green hydrogen projects being built by refiners. Why are they doing that? Because they are already using grey hydrogen in their processes. The grey hydrogen currently is used to crack diesel for diesel cracking. And if you use green hydrogen, you get a certain quota that is comparable to the green fuels quota. So you're comparing your hydrogen price, your green hydrogen price, not with the alternative, which is basically grey hydrogen, but with these biofuels, and biofuels are by definition very expensive. So you actually have a business case that doesn't really rely on subsidies per se, it relies on this quota regulation, and we actually see a lot of the larger electrolyzer projects that are currently being in development or being developed in that refinery space. So that's the second one. Let's see how much of the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, is helping to also drive some of those developments. I would say overall the volume in here can be further increased, but there's also a limit what you can do. The third category are projects that ultimately need subsidies, and in my view, many of those projects that we are talking about will need a subsidy for a long time. If that's really the case, and we just talked about the energy costs and the overall cost of the energy system, who's gonna underwrite the business case for the next 30, 40 years? You need subsidies on it. I think it's a very, very difficult decision. In my view, these large-scale projects that are on industrial scale, hydrogen production that are replacing alternative ways of producing certain goods and services with hydrogen, but cost about 2 or 3 times the amount, will be very, very difficult to see in the mid to long run. And therefore also I think they will have a hard time to really take off. Where I see more traction is on smaller scale projects where you currently use hydrogen, grey hydrogen in certain applications in your manufacturing chain, but it's only a small part of your overall energy costs or a small part of your raw material costs. And if it's grey hydrogen, in many cases, the grey hydrogen is then trucked in, i.e. it's very expensive actually to transport this grey hydrogen to the end customer, and therefore the costs per ton could easily be 15 to 20 tons currently. And at that level, you can also provide a solution on the green hydrogen side. The downside is that many of those customers only have small offtakes, so you really need to pool many of those smaller customers. And for a project developer, difficult to do. I think here utilities that actually are using or larger corporates that can use their pooling power have a better position. But just to summarize it, so I see four pillars, we'll say, of a hydrogen development having traction, where immediately on the infrastructure build-outs driven by the frameworks that are implemented as we speak, we see projects really on top of or supported by current subsidy per current quota systems. The third one is the subsidies, although I'm really skeptical on the subsidies. And the fourth one is smaller hydrogen, grey hydrogen replaced, or off-takers replacing grey hydrogen by green hydrogen. But you need really an accumulation point of view. I excluded in particular the large-scale import-oriented or export-oriented projects. I think there's a room for that. We also saw large financing rounds for that. So I wouldn't exclude that on a large scale outside of Europe. We see, for example, green ammonia production somewhere in the Middle East that is then transported to Europe under long-term offtake agreements. But I would exclude those projects for the moment.
Okay. May I ask you for some clarifications? You mentioned about infrastructure. Could an alternative be the transformation of the gas pipeline into hydrogen pipeline?
That's one of the options. Unfortunately, the EU Commission has, for whatever reason, the idea that this horizontal unbundling also has to happen. Ultimately, there's still a lot of uncertainty whether a gas network operator can ultimately own in the mid to long run also the hydrogen network. Makes a lot of sense. But that has now the perverse impact that a lot of those new pipes that are currently built are built from scratch at double or triple the price. But that's one of the ongoing discussions on the EU level. Hopefully we'll find a solution, but as I understand it, the latest proposal still talks about horizontal unbundling, which is not helpful.
Okay. Ms. Gallina, in the energy transition era, there is a great demand for clean energy, and clean energy from its part requires an unprecedented level of global investment in the development and construction, as already said, of new infrastructure. To achieve net zero objectives, it is anticipated that approximately 4 trillion euros is required worldwide on an annual basis of investments. Required especially in Europe. Sosteneo, if I pronounce it right, okay, through its mix of capabilities and innovation in the field of hydrogen production, has the knowledge to contribute to the effort of further development of hydrogen use. Could you tell us more about the new green hydrogen project that Sosteneo has recently invested in with other industrial operators?
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, Federica Gallina. I'm a representative of Sosteneo. Just a brief introduction. Sosteneo is a new affiliate within the Generali investment group. Generali is one of the biggest insurance and asset management firm globally, and Sosteneo is focused on infrastructure equity investments in greenfield projects regarding the ecological transition. We are pretty new, and nevertheless we made a number of investments so far. 3 big investments into standalone storage between UK and Australia, a couple of utility scale PV projects in Italy, and we recently entered into the green hydrogen space. To justify the reason why Sosteneo decided to believe in hydrogen, is also important to, if you allow me, to give a little bit of description of the Italian landscape and the way the institution have approached the hydrogen issue. First of all, the last climate and energy plan issued by the government, by the Italian government, includes hydrogen as one of the main tools allowing the process of decarbonization. And one of the most active regions in Italy in the implementation of this plan is Apulia. Apulia is a region which is located in the southeast area of the country, with let's say geographical conditions which are very similar to many of the areas of Greece, for instance. Apulia is one of the busiest regions in terms of renewable energy installation. It's 6.4 gigawatts installations between wind and PV. Over the last years, renewable energy operators have submitted to the TSO request for new connection for more than 80 gigawatts, 80, and many of those gigawatts theoretically would be located in Apulia. However, Apulia region is not perceiving this massive wave of requests positively for a number of reasons that are the ones that everybody knows: the impact on the landscape, the use of agricultural land with negative impact on the quality of the soil, the pressure on the grid network because of the concentration of production in certain hours. And clearly, those issues in part can be addressed by storage systems, but not maybe the most critical issue that Apulia region is facing, and it was also touched by some of my previous speakers, the fact that the electricity generated by renewable energy in Puglia is in large part exported to other regions. So the production, the yearly production is 35,000 gigawatt hour, the consumption is 16,000 gigawatt hour. And the reason is that most of the, basically the industrial and economic ecosystem of this area still relies upon traditional, conventional sources of natural gas. So when the region, as well as other public authorities and institutions, think about the way to optimize the use of electricity coming from renewable energy sources, which remains the most efficient one, and the need to meet certain targets of decarbonization for hard-to-abate sector, like iron and glass, or the transport sector, or the naval sector, the answer, the simplest answer is hydrogen, especially green hydrogen. So because of that, Apulia region implemented a number of legislations which are aimed at supporting the development of a local hydrogen supply chain and the development of green hydrogen plants. And they have estimated that between 1.5 and 2.3 billion euros will be allocated to those kind of initiatives. We are talking mainly about creation of big hydrogen valleys and conversion to hydrogen of the railway system. And this is extremely important, not only for the targets that we need to meet in terms of green transition, but also in terms of social impact, because those kind of investments are expected to bring new jobs for up to 7,000 units employed in the sector of hydrogen, just to justify the reason of our investments.
As a legal researcher, I'm quite interested in law and legal frameworks. So, what I would like to know is, Italy has adopted the specific regulatory framework for hydrogen, or has just added some additional provisions in the already existing framework for gas?
No, nothing specific. In particular, in Italy, the government can set general frameworks, and then there is a lot of delegation to the local authorities. And so certain of them, one is Apulia, which I mentioned, has set up 1 year ago an observatory, including all the main universities, research firm, industrial players like the one that are partnering with us on the initiative that I will describe soon, in setting the rules for those kind of investments. So it's still something that is in its development, yes.
Mr. Laumanns, let's talk about the European Union regulatory framework. We believe that the delegated acts and the general framework adopted by EU facilitates indeed development of business in the sector of hydrogen.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. Also hello from my side. Just a short introduction. I'm Ulrich Laumanns. I'm working as a project manager for GSZ. GSZ is an acronym for German International Cooperation, Deutsche Gesellschaft für Internationale Zusammenarbeit. We are basically a German public company which is active in the field of international cooperation for sustainable development worldwide. So in the field of hydrogen, we have also started quite a number of projects in the field of international cooperation around the world. We see a lot of interest from many countries that are looking at possibilities, let's say, to get involved in the production of hydrogen, possibly also export of hydrogen consumption for local demand. Here in Greece, since about 1 year, we have also started a project for, let's say, the development of a framework for hydrogen, which, as you said, very rightly at the beginning, until now it is missing. It is, yeah, maybe embryonic, but let's say, in fact, there's not much in terms of legislation now here in Greece, but yeah, we hope that we also, let's say, supporting the Greek government that this is going to change in the near future. So in the context of this project here in Greece, the so-called H2 Greece project, we're working together with the Greek government in order to develop a legislative, regulatory framework, support schemes for the development of the hydrogen market in the country. So, coming to your question, at the European level, we also saw a few years ago that basically there was nothing in terms of legislation, in terms of framework conditions for hydrogen. This has changed, I would say, quite a lot during the past years. Of course, 2021, July 2020, we had the European hydrogen strategy that was adopted with quite ambitious targets for the production of hydrogen in Europe, but also for the import of hydrogen from third countries into Europe. Because, of course, for the production of hydrogen, we need a lot of additional renewable energy installations, and we already see that, let's say, the renewable energy market in Europe tries to keep up with the demand just for electricity, and the demand for hydrogen comes on top of this, and it's quite significant. The targets from the European hydrogen strategy, they have even increased last year in the context of the REPower EU initiative of the Commission. So we're looking now at a target of 10 million tons of green hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, that is supposed to be produced in Europe, and an additional 10 million tons that are supposed to be imported from outside of Europe. So I would say these targets are quite ambitious. It's not clear if Europe is going to be able to achieve them, because these are targets for 2030, so we're talking about 7 years from now. And we also have to keep in mind that the hydrogen economy, the hydrogen market in Europe is at its very beginning. We're just starting with the implementation of, let's say, the first projects that in the production of hydrogen, but also the use of hydrogen. You've mentioned the delegated regulations that have been adopted this year. I think these were eagerly anticipated by the market and definitely necessary as a first step. Because the first thing that we need to clarify when we are talking about hydrogen is what do we mean when we talk about green hydrogen? What is this green hydrogen? We need a definition for this. We need to set clear criteria, let's say, for the production of this hydrogen. And we need to have a methodology how these criteria are going to be verified. So this is something that the Commission has now finally put in place after a lot of delays. The delegated acts originally they were supposed to be adopted much earlier. Let's say in the end, maybe the Commission has also, let's say, overshot a bit the target in terms of regulation. Of course, it's important to clarify the terminology of renewable hydrogen, but the criteria that the Commission has introduced by many market players are being perceived as overly restrictive. We have criteria like additionality, so we need to make sure that additional renewable energy investments are taking place, that hydrogen doesn't replace, let's say, existing renewables that are also need to be used for the decarbonization of the electricity sector. You have also requirements in terms of geographic correlation and finally in terms of temporary correlation. So these requirements in the end they add up to the costs of hydrogen production, which is of course a critical issue at a time where hydrogen is already or still quite expensive. And I also see that the criteria could, let's say, have a kind of negative effect in terms of the possibilities of electrolyzers, for example, to contribute to the flexibility of the electricity system. If you have to make sure that the electrolyzer is just operating in the hours where the renewable energy plants that you have contracted with are operating, basically, you're losing some flexibility that the electrolyzer could provide to the electricity system. Apart from the delegated acts, we also have to look at all the other directives that have been adopted by the Commission in the context of the Green Deal, the Fit for 55 package that was proposed by the Commission back in summer 2021, and which are now being adopted one by one by the European Parliament and the Council. So we have had, for example, the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Directive, which has also some obligations on member states to deploy hydrogen refueling stations, or minimum number of hydrogen refueling stations. We've had the amendment of the Renewable Energy Directive, which has also introduced quite a lot of new provisions for renewable hydrogen. So we have specific targets that have been set for, let's say, the share of renewable hydrogen, or so-called RFNBOs, renewable fuels of non-biological origin, which basically have to be met by all member states until 2030. So we have targets for the transport sector, 1% of RFNBOs in the transport sector. We have the aviation sector, where you also have a target for synthetic aviation fuels produced from hydrogen. We have the maritime sector, where also, let's say, there are some specific targets in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, we also have a target for the industry sector. So, let's say, until 2030, the hydrogen that is now being consumed in the industry sector, it needs to be 42% of this needs to be renewable. Yeah, so these targets by themselves, I think they're going to create basically automatically a market for green hydrogen in the next few years. So member states have to make sure that these targets are achieved, which means that they're going to have corresponding quotas on economic operators like fuel suppliers, for example, to have a certain share of the transport fuels to be provided from RFNBOs, synthetic fuels, or even from hydrogen by itself. So in this sense, let's say the Fit for 55 package has created, let's say, a rather good framework at the European level in terms of development of the hydrogen economy in the next years. Of course, this has to be transposed by member states, but yeah, it's something that we're going to see in the next few years.
Based on the two delegated acts, the principle of additionality was adopted. Do you think that this indeed is in favor of the production of hydrogen? And what kind of supportive instruments do you think that should be adopted in order to obtain the uptake of hydrogen?
Yeah, okay. As I said, let's say in favor of hydrogen, I would not say so. It has definitely added some costs.
Is it realistic to base the hydrogen production on exclusively new power plants? What is your opinion on this?
Yes, okay. I mean, it's something that the market is going to adapt to. These are the rules that have been set by the Commission. Of course, they're welcomed by the market in the sense that before we didn't have any rules at all. So there was complete lack of clarity what could be accepted as renewable hydrogen. So we have this clarity now. This is definitely a good thing, a positive development. Let's say in terms of the exact criteria, additionality, okay, we had a short discussion with Thomas before the session. I mean, if you look at other uses, for example, of renewable electricity for heat pumps or for electromobility, nobody is asking about additionality. Yeah, so the question is this really fair to impose such criteria on hydrogen? Okay, of course, at the same time, you also want to make sure that the hydrogen that you produce is really also physically as renewable as possible. So the idea was that the hydrogen should not, let's say, be produced from fossil fuels. Of course, this is something that nobody wants, and also in terms of the quantities that you need. Let's say the hydrogen, the consumption of electricity just for the hydrogen production, it's going to account for a very significant share of the renewable electricity that we have. So, yeah, in this sense, also, let's say after pressure from environmental lobbying groups, the Commission has decided to adopt this criteria, and okay, it could be changed in the future. Let's say it's something that we have to see how this is going to work. Let's say in the next years. So, yeah, the Commission has, I think, announced that they're going to review in 2027 these criteria, maybe also with a view to possibly changing them.
May I just add one thing, and if you think about hydrogen on a global scale, I think the real, I wouldn't call it tragedy, but the negative side is, so the EU Commission has adopted that one, but what we are seeing now is that on a global scale, the European framework seems to be implemented i.e. it's not really then putting the European producer at a big disadvantage, but I don't think it's helpful for really the global push that's needed on the hydrogen production. I mean, in the US now we have exactly the same discussions because they're basically copying here now what the EU has adopted, and I don't think that's helpful, but it is now a given, and I think difficult to change it.
So, do you think that will investors turn from blue and to grey hydrogen to green hydrogen investments?
I think it very much depends on the framework. Maybe you can go through your business case, but in a business case, as in any investment, you have two variables. The first one is what is the cost of the installation, so what's your capex, and then what's the cash flow coming out of those projects. And the cash flows out of those projects, we have seen projects that are working without subsidies and large hydrogen projects. I mean, I would just name 2 or 3 of them. There's one, and I think it was the first project finance project already 4 years ago, I think, a French dependance, an island in I think it's on the east coast of Africa. They basically had a new grant and the financing framework put in place to decarbonize the whole energy system of that island, and it was a combination of solar, wind, and hydrogen, and become energy independent. Big advantage there was they had to truck in or to ship in oil, which was expensive. So you're competing as an alternative versus your green solution with a quite expensive fuel. I think not too dissimilar what we have in some islands here in Greece. So that works because the alternative is just very expensive. We have seen a really large-scale financing on the green steel side, H2 Green Steel in Sweden, a completely new steel mill built next to the ore mine. So iron ore is just mined there. It's next door, it's processed in the steel mill, and the steel mill is completely new and will be powered by hydrogen. And the hydrogen is the power for the hydrogen is sourced from local hydro power plants. Big advantage there. There's an excess of hydropower in the north of Sweden, so you get actually the sourcing of that power is in the 20s. So I think the PPA was signed in the mid-20s euros per megawatt hour on a band. You don't really have to think about solar peaks, wind blowing. So you basically get green energy continuously, up to 600 megawatt electrolyzer feeding into the steel mill, and this green steel is then sold on the long-term offtake agreements with the large car manufacturers. I think there are 10-15-year contracts put in place. So that also works. I think it's a combination of low energy costs, minimum logistics because you're just next to also your integrated manufacturing hub, and transporting then the steel is also quite cheap to the off-takers. So that's the car manufacturers in the end were prepared to pay the premium price for the green steel, because the ultimate cost per car was really small, the additional cost. So that's a project that worked. As I mentioned, I think projects in the refining space work. They're not really depending on subsidies because you're competing then with the e-fuels obligations, and green hydrogen is basically counting towards those quotas. And with the increase in the quotas, that should bring more demand for this type of thing. And I think the last projects that I've seen on the large scale really taking FIDs are the large inputs projects. Leon is one example where in Saudi Arabia, wind solar is used to produce ammonia, green ammonia, and the green ammonia then shipped in large quantities either to Japan or to Europe, and Europe then has under the framework, on the import framework, where also contracts, 10-year contracts are available, and guaranteed 10-year offtakes for that one. So those are the projects that are currently working, but I think in order to really scale to the 10 million tons production in Europe, plus 10 million imports, I think we are at a fraction, at a small fraction of that. I think we are looking to half of it, and I'm not sure whether even half of it is realistic.
Yeah, just to add on an additional example, which is still early stage, so we are not talking about a project which is even close to an operational stage. But it's very recent news, we just published that this morning, that Sosteneo has entered into a partnership for the development of two big hydrogen plants in Apulia region. We are together with two major industrial players in Italy, Edison and Saipem. Saipem is responsible for the engineering activities, and a small participation, 5%, is also owned by REIA Italia, which is a state-owned entity that is responsible for the conversion to green of the iron sector in Italy. So the overall capacity of the electrolyzers is 160 megawatt, which will be fed by electricity produced by 600 megawatt of PV plants located in the same region. Those plants will be able to produce more or less 450 million cubic meters per year. That will allow to meet 10% of the needs of the local iron industry. So we will have the supplier of the electricity. We will be close to the biggest iron plants. We will have the off-taker, which is still this state-owned entity that again will basically will basically acquire the hydrogen to produce this specific kind of iron that will be used by the local iron industry. So this is a system which theoretically would make this project bankable, because all the major or main risk would be allocated. Nevertheless, in order to make it profitable, we also rely upon a big bulk of EU grants, which are dedicated to big hydrogen plants of big relevance in Europe. So the overall capex we're talking about is 700 million euros, more or less, and more than 50% should be covered by subsidies. So yeah, it's
how many years do you need in order to initiate the production?
Look, one of the projects is already under development. A special fast track was created by the entities to approve those projects. So we expect this project to be fully permitted Q3 next year and enter into operation by 2026.
Licensing procedures are quite easy or no? It doesn't grace.
It's usual as all the renewable energies, very complex and really rely upon the will of the local authorities. So they can speed up processes or slow them down depending on the appetite of the specific technology. Luckily enough, maybe this is one of the first big projects in a region which is supporting, so we are again relying upon this fast track. But this is the only big project in Italy, because there are a number of other projects, more or less 600 megawatts spread over the whole territory, all small size plants.
I don't know if there is any question from the audience.
Yeah.
an hydrogen expert, but I know the fundamentals that we all learned in the university, at least the engineers. So we know that apart from the fact that hydrogen needs energy to be produced, there is a risk regarding the storage. There is a risk from the fact that it's very flammable and can die to explosions. And we need a very expensive infrastructure, as you just said. My question to our banker friend here is, practically, if you give a loan to a very good European company in Greece, which makes renewables with a 6% interest, how much more interest would you ask for all the risks of the hydrogen? 100% more, 50% more, 20% more?
I can't give you a number, as we haven't really seen a lot of those projects, but you're absolutely right. If you just provide the financing, not on the equity side but on the debt side, you have no upside, so you only have downside, and you need to price in those risks. I mean, many of those risks you would potentially not really price in as an additional margin. I mean, there's some margin you price in, but with certain reserve accounts or other insurance products or other things to mitigate those risks. Because even if you charge double, if the whole thing doesn't really work, it doesn't really help you much. So I think you have to structure more. You have to do more work on the structuring of the financing to actually allow for maybe half a year of production stops where you have to do some repairs and you still can service your debt. So debt service free accounts and other insurance products, I think should help you mitigate some of that. But it will become more expensive for the project developer, because ultimately this means you can't really just have the cash flow that's coming in going through. Some of that is stuck somewhere in the system.
Anyone else?
I mean, just one last comment on that. As a bank, what is more than worry currently is, number one, whether the capex cost is really the capex cost. There are hardly any EPC contractors who underwrite 100 megawatt is X, and that's what I pay you, and you deliver, you guarantee delivery and operation of the plants. I think that's number one problem. So who takes that risk on the capex side, overruns? And the second one is, do you have qualified operators? And currently there are not really many out there that are actually qualified operators that have some track record in actually running those type of plants or electrolyzers.
Okay, so my question is quite related to the previous one. I'm wondering, what's the role of banks in financing hydrogen projects, assuming, I mean, there's technological risk, there's a risk of building a profitable and bankable business case. So if your colleague sitting next to you from Sosteneo, which would pitch her project to you, what would be the key risk aspects you would consider, and what is the financing structure? Would you look at non-recourse project financings, or as we have seen for renewable projects for many years, or what will be the financing concept for hydrogen projects?
Yeah, currently there are hardly any really pure SPV type of hydrogen project financings out there. I mentioned 2 or 3 examples. I think they all have very specifics attached to it. Many projects, how they are really done is they're initially on a fully equity basis developed, built, and then the hope is after 2 years or 1 year of operations, you can then put some financing on top, so it's easier. But from the outside, I think it's not too dissimilar what you would see on any other project financing. You have to make sure that initially that the outlays for getting the project off the ground and operational are covered. So to the extent you don't have a sufficient equity backing the whole thing, you need some guarantees or some sort of framework around that one. That's what I mentioned. You have to make sure that the capex that you put into your assumptions and where you lend against is actually then sufficient to build the project. I mentioned certain structures in the cash flow, and it's cascading, that just make sure that you have sufficient cash reserves also in periods when you are not operational or when there are certain issues. And then the other big issue is the offtake in the end. In many cases, there is not really a traded market for hydrogen, so it's not like a renewables farm, be it solar or wind. If the offtaker falls away, you just sell it into the grid. You can't do that. So in many cases, it's a bespoke solution. So there's a lot of thought and analysis on the offtake structure and who is really supporting and behind that offtake structure.
I believe that after the usual 5-6 years, the banks will adapt to the market. Usual time banks tend to use to adapt. The first subsidized PV, then it's fine. After a couple of years of adjustment, banks were happy to finance PPAs. Now they're even proposing, why don't you go merchant for a couple of years and then we'll see and we'll discuss. They financed CSP, which is an additional quite critical technology. So yes, starting from a strong investor, they will also start financing those kind of more complex solutions, I believe.
Maybe just to add on this capex risk that you mentioned, I think this has become quite significant in the last couple of years. Inflationary pressures, the increase in prices of electrolyzers, for example. We've seen, let's say, within 1 year, basically electrolyzer prices increased by 50%. That's a huge amount, and let's say there's no clarity in which direction the market is going to go in the next few years. So due to these capex increases, there have also been quite a number of projects that have been cancelled, that have not proceeded with investment decision.
You've got one more question.
Yes, one more question. I have a question regarding the leverage cost of hydrogen. I never heard, maybe I wasn't careful enough, but you didn't mention anything about it. Let's say for this perspective of the bank, also the non-recourse project financing, what would be your target if somebody comes to you and offers you a project? What you will tell him? What is the range that you expect that he will have in this project? And the second one is, actually the first one is what is let's say the current payback period for the project you use. I'm not talking about the rate of return, I'm talking about the payback period that you see currently in the market. Thank you very much.
Yeah, on the leverage cost on the levelized cost of hydrogen, I think it's difficult to say because it's very, very specific to applications. I mean, I'll just give you an example. You might actually be able to produce hydrogen with a cheap PPA in the 4 or 5 euro per ton range, but if you then have to compress the whole thing and you have to store it, and if you only have solar PV as an input, you need some storage in between. It can double or triple very easily for the end off-taker, the cost. So what you would typically look at is what's the ultimate system cost, whole value chain cost to the off-taker. And as I mentioned, in many cases, the smaller projects I'm looking at actually have grey hydrogen delivered to the factory door at 15 to 20 euros per ton, because it's just the logistic costs are so high. And at that level, you can also do something on the green side. If you have, say, an anchor off-taker and then you just build a framework around it. The downside is just those off-takers, they just take, I don't know, 3% or 10% or 5% of your production capacity. So you really have to align 15, 20, 30 guys of that, and on a project level, financial investors behind it, you can't really structure that. Yeah? So that's why a lot of those projects, I think, will be more destined to be developed by big utilities or by big current grey hydrogen producers, because they already have the logistics, or they can handle this small offtake thing. So what I'm trying to say is, levelized cost of hydrogen, I think, is a misguiding figure, because ultimately you need to look at what's really the delivery cost at the gate of the customer. And in many cases, that's not driven really by the hydrogen price itself, but by the logistic cost in between.
So, if there is no other question, thank you for your attention. And the floor is to the next session. The floor is for the lunch.
Thank you.